a fleet of 17 ships carrying 4,500 troops. Franklin stayed on in Passy until 1785, 2 years after he successfully negotiated another treaty, the one that ended the war.
Franklin's mission in France was as vague as any mission could be. He had been told by Congress he should procure whatever help he could, preferably money, of course, eventually ships. An alliance would be wonderful. Franklin succeeded beyond all hope in his mission. Everything that he had been asked to do was done. He got the money. He bled France white. I think if poor King Louis was eventually sent to the guillotine, it was because he had destabilized the French treasury to such a point by helping this country conquer its independence that, in a way, I think Franklin bears a little blame for the death of the unfortunate King Louis.
After a winter of illness and short rations, spring of 1778 brought the Continental Army at Muddy Valley Forge two great causes for hope: news of the alliance with France and the arrival of Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, one of many European officers who had come to America seeking fame and fortune. The Prussian drill master arrived with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin and a desire to teach discipline to Washington's untrained army. Shortly after his arrival, he began drilling the troops through every daylight hour.
The genius of this nation is not in the least to be compared with that of the Prussians, Austrians, or French. You say to your soldier, do this, and he doeth it. But I am obliged to say, this is the reason why you ought to do that. And then he does it. Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben.
When some movement or maneuver was not performed to his mind, he began to swear in German, then in French, then in both languages together. When he had exhausted his artillery of foreign oaths, he would call to his aides, "Come and swear for me in English. These fellows won't do what I bid them." A good-natured smile then went through the ranks, and at last the maneuver, or the movement, was properly performed. Pierre Duponcel, von Steuben's translator.
The entry of France into the war caused the British to completely rethink their strategy.
The British switched from the attack to the defense in early 1778. They had to redeploy men to protect their fisheries in Nova Scotia and to foil the French anticipated attack on their sugar islands in the West Indies. The British were forced to consolidate their positions, and New York City was the strategically more important position, and so they abandoned Philadelphia and were retreating to New York City.
In June of 1778, Sir Henry Clinton, now in command of the British troops in America, set out overland for New York City with 13,000 men in a wagon train 12 miles long. The slowly moving target was irresistible for Washington and his von Steuben-trained forces. On the 28th of June, he attacked Clinton's rear guard near Monmouth, New Jersey, with part of his own army of 13,000. The resulting battle would become the largest land engagement of the Revolution.
I presume everyone has heard of the heat of that day, but none can realize it that did not feel it. Joseph Plum Martin.
It was 96 degrees at about 9 o'clock that morning. And by the middle of the day, the temperature had to be 110, possibly 120. A number of soldiers on both sides simply dropped dead from heat exhaustion.
Washington had initiated the battle with 5,000 of his troops under the command of Continental General Charles Lee, a former officer of the British Army, who had been openly critical of him.
Washington is not fit to command a sergeant's guard. Charles Lee.
But early in the fighting, Lee had ordered his troops to retreat. Washington rode to the front and furiously confronted Lee for his puzzling command.
an officer named Scott from Virginia who overheard the incident said that as a connoisseur of profanity, he felt that Washington's damning of Lee at that moment was the most beautiful he had ever heard. He swore until the leaves shook on the trees and like an angel from heaven.
Washington, of course, at this time didn't know it, but the whole British army was there. It wasn't the rear guard, and they were coming after Lee like a piece of raw meat. They really were going to chew him into little pieces. So in a sense, Lee was doing the right thing. He did see that he was outnumbered, and he was trying to fall back to a better position.
Washington relieved Lee of his command and began to rally his troops.
Many of his supporters characterized Monmouth as Washington's finest hour. His generalship during the day was only adequate. Where his leadership was superb, though, was encouraging his men and making them feel very good about the American army. He rode back and forth in front of the lines and making appropriate gestures or words to his men, rode one horse to death, had to start a second, and was frequently exposed to enemy fire.
General Washington seemed to arrest fortune with one glance. His presence stopped the retreat. His graceful bearing on horseback, his calm and deportment, which still retained a trace of displeasure, were all calculated to inspire the highest degree of enthusiasm. I thought then, as now, that I had never beheld so superb a man. Marquis de Lafayette.
With Washington's encouragement, the Continentals held their positions. Both armies settled into an afternoon of furious artillery fire.
This field would have been wreathed in acrid smoke. The troops would have been choking on it. At the same time, they enjoyed a spectacular sound and light show. So for most of the afternoon, this was a no man's land, a smoke-filled no man's land between the two armies. We have been surprised to find out how many persons of color were in the Revolutionary Army, and there were many at the Battle of Monmouth, hundreds. In fact, as many as 7 or 8% of the Continental Army may have been composed of persons of color. Mostly African Americans, some free blacks, some slaves who had taken their masters' places.
African Americans were active participants on both sides in the Revolution. Their motivation was general patriotism, but also a personal belief that the war and its successful completion would bring them personal freedom, freedom for their people, and personal advancement.
During that sweltering afternoon, Mary, or Molly Ludwig Hayes, joined her husband in battle, helping to man one of the big guns. Because she spent most of the morning carrying pitchers of water to dehydrated soldiers, popular history knows her as Molly Pitcher.
It's quite clear that, like many other soldiers during that battle, Molly Pitcher was enjoying herself. When enough of the men collapsed around that gun, she was tough enough to step forward and play with the boys.
While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case, it might have carried away something else, and continued her occupation. Joseph Plum Martin.
It was the closest thing to a formal battle that the American Army had fought in quite a while. And they did amazingly well. They slugged it out with the British, and they stood toe-to-toe and showed that they could hold their own in the field.
I singled out a man and took my aim directly between his shoulders. He was a good mark, being a broad-shouldered fellow. What became of him I know not. The fire and smoke hid him from my sight. One thing I know, that is, I took as deliberate aim at him as I ever did at any game in my life. But after all, I hope I did not kill him, although I intended to at that time. Joseph Plum Martin.
The exhausted armies quit the Battle of Monmouth at nightfall.